I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome to the Sky News Daily, where we are celebrating the fact 2024 could well be the world's biggest election year ever. Half the world's population could be voting in places as disparate as the United Kingdom, the United States, India, and if you're an election fan, this weekend, plenty to be interested in over in Taiwan. So we have our US correspondent Mark Stone, we have our deputy political editor Sam Coates, and also our Asia correspondent Helen-Ann Smith, all standing by. Mark and Sam, of course, have already accepted that they'll be seeing an awful lot less of their families in 2024. The Iowa caucus just around the corner, and of course the UK domestic election campaign really ratcheting up. But as we have the rare privilege of having three of our Sky News correspondents here, I am just wondering who has the most election to cover. Mark, let's start with you. What's the significance where you are?
The limelight is going to be on American politics because we are looking, as the polls would suggest at the moment, at Trump 2.0, with all that entails. I may be wrong, we're a year out, but it's looking like Trump versus Biden, and I think, you can come back to me in a year's time, but I think Donald Trump stands a pretty good chance of returning to the White House.
Is 2024 going to be the first big turning point in British politics since 2010, where the voters throw out a Conservative incumbent Prime Minister and replace them with a Labour Prime Minister? Will Keir Starmer be in number 10 by the end of the year? Will the UK buck the trend internationally, with a lot of other countries moving to the right? Could we see Britain move to the left in that period? And what kind of difference will it make?
What about you, Helen-Ann? What exactly is your pitch, speaking to us as you are from Taiwan, not Beijing?
Well, I mean, Taiwan is a small place. It's got a pretty small electorate, but arguably this is the election that has the greatest chance of actually sparking real-world conflict off the back of it.
I'll let the listeners decide who's won that particular one. But surely we should start with Taiwan, as it is the most immediate. Helen-Ann, this is incredibly significant. I mean, China has described the election in Taiwan as a choice between war and peace. That's pretty grim.
Well, exactly that. It's such an important election, despite the fact, as I said, it's a small place with a relatively small electorate, because the island of Taiwan has this extremely big, extremely powerful neighbour who thinks that it should have a stake in what happens here. And that, of course, is China. Because remember, Taiwan is a self-governing island. It's a flourishing democracy. It's an economic powerhouse. It's a wonderful place in many, many ways. But China, it sees it as a breakaway province. It sees it as part of its territory. And the ruling party in China, the Communist Party, have for many years sought reunification. The current leader, Xi Jinping, has made it a very clear stated ambition that he wants to bring China back into the fold, if you like. It is very tense between Taiwan and China at the moment. On a daily basis, we have Chinese fighter planes flying towards this island. In the past few years, we've basically had a complete breakdown of communications between Taipei and Beijing. Beijing's made real efforts to sort of poach any remaining diplomatic allies that Taiwan might have. Remember, officially, Taiwan's not an independent country, and therefore it is complicated diplomatically for Taiwan internationally. Although it has friends, it doesn't necessarily have those official diplomatic allegiances. Be in no doubt, voters here are very, very aware of that context and very aware of that threat from China. And although lots of people here are descended from the Chinese mainland, there's actually a fleeting minority now who would want to see any sort of reunification. And increasingly here, people do see themselves as Taiwanese.
Just to be absolutely clear, a self-governing island, not an independent state in the way that we would recognise it, but in terms of the democratic process, from what you are suggesting, it sounds an awful lot more like that which we are used to in the West than that which, the Chinese people are just a few miles away.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, democracy here is flourishing. It's not actually a very old democracy. They've only had democracy here for just under 30 years, but there are free and fair elections. They are well run. But Taiwan is not an independent country. It is not recognised as such. So it's a really kind of complicated, precarious position that Taiwan has, whereby it governs itself, it makes its own laws, it has its own military, it runs its own economy, it runs these elections, but it is not officially able to make representations internationally because, of course, China thinks it's part of its territory. And and makes very threatening moves anytime it makes any of those sort of representations.
Explain what is going to happen on Saturday, the 13th of January, when 23 million voters go and cast their ballots on the president, the vice president, and in fact, I think all members of parliament as well.
Yeah, that's right. So there is a very healthy choice here in Taiwan. The front runner at the moment is a man called Lai Ching-tse. He is the representative from the ruling DPP party, the Democratic Progressive Party. That's the party that's actually currently in government at the moment. But the current president, Tsai Ing-wen, she's done 2 terms under Taiwanese law. 2 terms is the term limit, so it's her time to step aside. And Lai Ching-tse is actually her current vice president. So he's a relatively well-known figure. Worth saying, the DPP as a party, now they're the most sort of hard line against China. We wouldn't go as far as saying they're pro-independence. It's really important to emphasize that none of the parties are officially pro-independence. Saying that publicly would bring real wrath from China. And Lai Ching-tse, the candidate, he's seen as Beijing as a pretty provocative figure because in his past he's made many much more overtly pro-independence statements. So Beijing has labelled him a troublemaker, a warmonger. I mean, for Beijing, he really is a bad option, and he is the guy who is most likely to win. But he's not the only option. You have the opposition party, the KMT. They're sort of seen as a bit softer on China. They want to see more dialogue with the mainland. They're not pro-unification, to be clear. No parties are pro-unification, but they take that slightly softer line. And then there's actually a third candidate as well, who's seen as a bit of a wild card, a bit of an agitator in this election, a man called Ko Wen-je. He is appealing to a lot of young people. He's focusing much more on the economy and domestic issues. There is, to all intensive purposes, a competitive, vibrant race underway here in Taiwan.
So what happens if this election doesn't go the way that China wants, or goes the opposite of the way that China wants, I should probably say?
It's a really good question, and no one's entirely clear exactly how Beijing will respond. It's just worth saying, actually, Beijing's been a little quiet this week. In the run-up to the last election in 2020, there was a lot of overt threats made, and it was actually seen as having pushed a lot of voters towards the DPP candidate, the current president, Tsai Ing-wen, and she won quite unexpectedly, actually. So there is some suggestion that China being actively quite quiet this week on purpose to not have that effect. But look, if Lai Ching-tse wins, as he's expected to do, it seems pretty unlikely that Beijing will not respond in some way. Ahead of and after previous elections, we have seen things like fighter jets flying towards this island. We've seen things like missiles being fired. It's possible that we'll see more kind of spy balloon type crafts flying over the Taiwan Strait. There's been quite a lot of those in recent weeks. There will almost certainly be strong statements. Whether anything tips over into more active conflict, at the moment, I think that's highly, highly unlikely. And the reason for that is just that it's really not a good time for Beijing. There is a relatively significant economic sort of not crisis, but challenge underplay at the moment in China. It's all felt a little unstable sort of domestically in China. So I just think they don't have the stability internally right now to also launch a war. And there's no sign as well that they are preparing for that. There's no obvious ramping up of the military, no obvious ramping up of domestic propaganda to prepare the Chinese people for that eventuality. So I think full war is unlikely.
Back with Helen-Ann in a moment. We'll get round some of the other countries getting ready to vote in 2024 too, so don't go away. Helen-Ann Smith, our Asia correspondent, is on this episode of The Daily ahead of the Taiwanese elections, and we will be talking about the American presidential election shifting up a gear in the coming days too. On the United States, Helen-Ann, it is an interesting, it is a nuanced relationship between the US and Taiwan. President Biden and others will be keeping a very close eye on what happens there.
Yeah, absolutely. The Americans will be watching very, very closely indeed. And they'll no doubt be hoping that all of this passes without a hitch. Now, officially, America's relationship with Taiwan is a relatively informal one. It does not recognize Taiwan as an independent country. To do so would massively jeopardize its all-important diplomatic relationship with China. It is bound by law to provide weapons to help Taiwan defend itself, but there is no treaty that says it's bound to send troops in the event of an invasion. But Joe Biden has said a number of times, both sort of off the cuff and a little bit more formally, that he would defend Taiwan if anything happened to it. But look, be in no doubt, America's official position is that it supports the status quo, and that if the status quo is going to change, it needs to happen in a peaceful way. And that's absolutely their bottom line.
Helen-Ann, thanks very much. Mark Stone, our US correspondent, listening in on that. I mean, does that ring true from where you're sitting?
It does, I think. And from Joe Biden's perspective, sitting in the White House right now, he already has two global conflicts that he is currently dealing with. The prospect of a third one, well, it is the nightmare scenario for him, and potentially the most serious one as well. I mean, remember, and Helen-Ann has and will talk much more about this in the months ahead, but the prospect of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan and how the West would respond to that. I mean, it makes other conflicts look like small fry, I think. And so he's clearly very, very worried about that. Remember, this is the man who wanted to end forever wars and tried to bring troops home from Afghanistan, indeed did. But the optics of that were absolutely awful, and that's what people remember. And politics is all about perception and not necessarily reality. And it's clear that for a vast swathe of conservatives across America right now, things don't look great. They see huge inflation. They see foreign wars. They see chaos on the southern border. They see inner city crime. They see an opioid crisis. I could go on and on. That is what they see. If you're a conservative in the middle of America, you look back at Donald Trump's years in office and you don't remember the chaos that maybe some beyond America's borders remember. You remember a time when things felt better.
Let's focus then, Mark, on the path to the White House, which, as is traditional now, starts in Iowa in just a few days' time. The Iowa caucus, explain exactly what is going on there. You might want to also start by explaining exactly what a caucus is.
It is the most extraordinary and perhaps the purest form of democracy, or the most mad form of democracy. Iowa traditionally is always the place that is the starting gun for the most the longest presidential or the longest election campaign you can imagine. We're a year off, just under a year off, and yet it is all begun, and it will all begin this weekend in Iowa. The starting gun, and across, I think it is, I'm looking here, 1,600 precincts in 99 different counties of the Midwest state of Iowa, which incidentally is absolutely freezing this weekend. Minus 18, I think the temperature is going to be in Iowa. So wish me luck there. So what's going to happen is in town halls, in church halls, in schools, in these 1,600 precincts, people will gather and they will listen to people, ordinary people, representing the candidate that they think should be the Republican Party candidate. And then people will vote for that candidate. It's kind of really basic, simple democratic stuff. And at the end of that process, there will be a winner. And over the course of the previous few decades, Iowa has always been this place where the field has been big and momentum has been found by one or two different candidates who don't actually often end up being the one that makes it to the White House. In the past, that has not been the case. It's not a bellwether state in that sense, but it gives the different candidates momentum and it whittles it down. This time, I think it's different because there are really only three candidates worth looking at. They are Donald Trump, they are Nikki Haley, and Ron DeSantis. And only one of those stands a real chance. I mean, Donald Trump is so much further ahead than Haley and DeSantis that it's hard to see how the other two catch up. So in that sense, Iowa is a bit different this year. Nevertheless, it'll be fascinating to see just how well Donald Trump does and to see who comes second. If Haley comes second, Nikki Haley, former UN ambassador under Donald Trump, former South Carolina governor, if she does better than DeSantis, then she is the one that gets the momentum into the second part of the process in New Hampshire in a couple of weeks' time. And perhaps she then becomes a possible contender to Donald Trump for the Republican Party nomination. I haven't even mentioned the Democrats because Joe Biden is the candidate, because he's the incumbent. He's the one who says he's going to run again, and so no one's standing in his way, which may be a terrible decision.
We will find out. But in terms of Donald Trump, I mean, is his Republican nomination absolutely nailed on, given that there have been, a number of states that have suggested or have acted in fashion to remove him or to try and stop him from being able to get the Republican nomination?
Two states, Colorado and Maine at the moment, although have both said that he should be removed from the ballot in those states. But those decisions are pending appeals that will take place. And it's almost certain that the Supreme Court of the United States will look into those. And the Supreme Court, remember, is weighed. More judges on that court are conservative leaning. They're supposed to be independent. They may well be, but people won't believe that they are necessarily. So we'll see what the Supreme Court decision is on that. So it's really up in the air as to what happens. My sense is that the Supreme Court will say that he does have to be on. He is allowed to be on the ballot. So that will go away. Nevertheless, he does face many court cases. I think it goes back to what I said a moment ago. Is that if Nikki Haley comes through as a potential contender going into the rest of the primaries in the months ahead, then voters, just conservative voters, will have a decision to make.
On what issues do you think that the 2024 presidential election will be fought, Mark? I mean, the reason I ask this, I mean, sometimes people suggest it's about the personalities at the top. Some people say it's the economy. Stupid. You know, there are many different, and some even suggest that there are local domestic issues that really affect individual results in individual states. What's your take?
The economy, number one, is the most important thing, I think, to voters. Number two, if you're a conservative, it is the southern border. Objectively, that is absolute chaos. I mean, forget, the issues you're having over in the UK with Dover, Calais and migrants there. I mean, the issue on the southern border is chaos here. Joe Biden says it's not his fault. He is locked in an issue with Congress in terms of having to introduce legislation to deal with it. But that is a visual example of where conservatives think Biden chaos is playing out on the southern border. So those are two absolutely key issues. If you are a Democrat, the prospect of democracy unfolding and democracy falling apart, that is a big issue. Those are, I think, the key issues. But if you are a conservative, and I think people will be wondering. People beyond America may be wondering how Donald Trump, a man who faces 4 court cases, however many felony charges against him, how he could possibly be the nominee potentially for president. I think if you are a conservative in America, you see an elderly man in Biden, a man who fluffs his words the whole time, a man who is running a country which is materially worse in their view than it was under Donald Trump. And you think that Biden cannot possibly be president once again. That is the assessment of many conservatives around the country.
Sam, I know you are as giddy as I am at the prospect of having elections in the United States, around about the same time as the elections in the UK. And with Rishi Sunak saying it's going to happen in the second half of the year, it certainly feels that way. Is there any chance that what is happening in US politics will colour the election campaign that we experience here domestically?
Oh, absolutely. And that's going to be potentially one of the most fascinating things to happen this year. Worth saying we don't know for certain when the election's going to be. It's the working assumption of Rishi Sunak that it's the second half of the year. I'm told that the date that they're looking at is Thursday, November the 14th. That's 9 days, obviously, after the US presidential election. So if you just then think about all the big moments in UK-US politics and sort of put them in a timeline together, you can see there are plenty of opportunities for sort of overlap. Now, I'm not saying that Americans are going to pay a huge amount of attention to the UK election, but I think it's inevitable that we look across the pond in the other direction. And you have heard just in the last few months Donald Trump talk about British politics, talk about Rishi Sunak in the context of some of the decisions to water down the green pledges, the net zero pledges that decision that he took in September. That prompted comment, approving comment, I have to say, from Donald Trump. Now, in choosing the 14th of November, I'm fascinated in the sort of working logic of Tory strategists, because they have clearly thought and gamed that it must be to their advantage to have all of this happening at the same time as the US election, campaign. They must think there is a benefit or an advantage, because they could have gone earlier. They could have gone, for instance, a date in October before the clocks go back. But there are going to be moments. There'll be moments we won't anticipate them. They'll just happen. where UK politics gets dragged into the US debate, and we'll watch as it ricochets across the Atlantic. And that hasn't happened in absolutely decades. So bring it on.
I've heard it here as well that diplomats have warned against the idea of having two elections in two such key countries globally close to each other. Because of the security risks that it could pose and the market risks as well. You'll have a lack of direction and a lack of credibility in foreign policy because the politicians in both those countries will be focusing elsewhere. And we're already seeing it here in America, clearly, with Joe Biden focused domestically on his re-election campaign and not necessarily focused, for example, on the Middle East, perhaps. There is already noise here in Washington that on Ukraine, the Biden administration might try and push Zelensky to find some sort of peace deal with Putin because they want to see an end to that conflict. They wanted to see an end to that conflict well before now. They did not want to go into the 2024 election campaign with that still happening.
Okay, but Sam, let's focus very specifically then on the significance of this year's general election. I don't know about you, but to me it does feel like this could be one of the biggest turning points. The only thing that makes me kind of doubt that is, a Labour government, an incoming Labour government, would be limited by the amount of cash that there is in the Treasury. There will be things that they would wish to do that they might not be able to do given the economic forecast.
I mean, Labour's being incredibly blunt about this at the moment. They're saying there isn't going to be a lot of cash. There's going to be almost no cash. Any cash that they do have is going to have to be found from savings elsewhere. So this is not going to be, it's going to be a Labour election campaign like we haven't seen before, where Labour isn't planning to inject a huge amount of cash into the NHS. So it'll be the first time in my lifetime where there isn't an arms race between the parties to prop up the NHS, with everything that means. Indeed, that there isn't money really for anything. And I think you're right to home in on exactly this point, Neil, because if that's the case, then people will focus on the question, well, what's the difference between the two of them? Is it, Keir Starmer just saying the same but a bit better, the same but a bit more serious, the same but without the Conservative Party? Now, that's to underplay some of the other differences, and it's certainly to underplay the instincts and likely medium-term direction if Labour comes to power. But it will be the essay question at this election. And if people look at two technocratic leaders who, let's be honest, don't set the world alight, either of them. And if the Conservative Party can make Rishi Sunak get Rishi Sunak to advance the case that Keir Starmer represent a risk, a threat, then maybe, just maybe, there is some kind of path for the Conservatives.
And you and I, Sam, will be dwelling on the domestic politics time after time after time here on the Daily Podcast. So let's park it just for a second. As mentioned at the very beginning, this is the world's biggest year in elections. You being, as much of an elections geek as anyone I've ever encountered, I'm coming in a close second. I don't know the stats. I just get excited by it. Just tell me, what other elections, just a couple of them, are really grabbing you this year?
Well, let's give you a big number to start with, Neil. It's about 3.5 billion people are going to go to the polls. The biggest of those is actually in India. When you look at Narendra Modi's popularity ratings,
Indian PM, yeah,
he's doing incredibly well. He's getting back in this year. So the course, the not uncontroversial course he has set for India will continue, and the economic improvement that he has promised and to some degree has delivered in India over the last few years will continue. But if I care about one set of elections beyond the UK, Neil, I think it's actually the European elections. Now, Europe's on the cusp of potentially a really big, interesting, and for some people, scary experiment. The right is on the rise. The kind of, not the centre right, but proper right-wing parties are on the rise across Europe. You could see what's already happened with Meloni in Italy. You can see all over the sort of Eastern European bloc right-wing parties thriving. Is there an anti-immigration big surge in the European elections? And what does that mean for European countries and the European Union, which is, of course, founded on free movement? And what kind of ties do British Conservative politicians seek to forge with a new anti-migration right across Europe. Could we see the constellation of politics shifting, with perhaps a Tory party in opposition forging links with all of these anti-migration parties across Europe, to the massive detriment of the European project as it is at the moment? Could we be seeing the beginning of something even bigger after what's happening this year?
I mean, Mark, given that you will be working on US politics from now until this time next year,
and beyond,
I suppose the thing that you're looking forward to is a holiday in 2025, yeah?
Well, I don't think I'll get one. I think, it is after the moment that we have to focus properly, don't we? And I think after the election, when the dust settles, whether that be another 4 years of Joe Biden, if indeed he is the candidate. I mean, he is the candidate at the moment, but anything could happen. I'll finish by saying that Sam described the two politicians vying to be PM in the UK as dull technocrats. Well, you've got two dull technocrats in the UK. You've got two elderly men here in the US, one of whom is facing multiple criminal charges. What a time for democracy.
Mark, Sam, and of course Helen-Ann, thank you so much. And that's your lot for this edition of the Sky News Daily. We'll see you next time.